As child star Lucille Ricksen recovered from exhaustion, a scream pierced the silence of her home. Her brother rushed into the room, certain he was about to find her lifeless body. What he saw instead was far more unsettling, an image that would haunt the family long after. Today, the name Lucille Ricksen barely rings a bell, yet in the early 1920s her face was everywhere, plastered across magazines and studio promotions as Hollywood's newest miracle child. Behind that carefully crafted image was a far harsher reality. Born in 1910 to Dutch immigrants Samuel and Ingeborg Nielsen Eriksson, she entered the world as Ingeborg Myrtle Elizabeth Eriksson, in a family struggling to survive in a foreign land. Opportunity, however, came at a cost. Before she could even understand what fame meant, she was placed in front of cameras as an underpaid baby model, following a path her older brother Marshall had also taken, though he never reached the same heights. In a twist of fate, his lack of success may have saved him. By 1914, Ingeborg had been renamed Lucille Ricksen, transformed into a marketable star at just 4 years old. Studios praised her, audiences adored her, and her parents relied on the income she generated to escape poverty. But as her fame grew, so did the toll it took on her fragile body and mind. The very industry that lifted her into the spotlight was slowly draining her strength, setting the stage for a tragic story hidden behind a child's smile, one that still raises unsettling questions about the true cost of early Hollywood fame. By the time Lucille turned 8, cracks had begun to form within her family. Her parents separated, and some sources suggest that Lucille's rapidly rising career placed an unbearable strain on their marriage. Others believe her father may have started to fear what the future held for his young daughter. Whatever the reason, the divorce marked a turning point. Custody of both children was awarded to their mother, a decision that, in hindsight, many believe may have led Lucille and her brother Marshall down a far more troubling path than if they had remained with their father. Before the family fell apart, both Lucille and Marshall appeared in modeling work and small film roles, together providing a steady income for their parents. After the separation, however, the dynamic shifted dramatically. Reports indicate that their mother began to see Lucille, the more successful of the two, as the family's primary source of financial survival. Lucille had already appeared in her first film, The Millionaire Baby, at just 5 years old, a role that quietly placed her on Hollywood's radar. That early exposure soon attracted the attention of powerful producer Samuel Goldwyn. At his suggestion, Lucille's mother uprooted the family and moved to Hollywood. In 1920, Lucille arrived in the film capital with her mother and brother, and within the same year, she appeared in her first Hollywood production. Now only 10 years old, Lucille was signed by Goldwyn to star opposite fellow child actor Edward Peel Jr., a moment celebrated as a major breakthrough, yet one that would also bind her even tighter to an industry that was already shaping and slowly consuming her childhood. Through a string of short silent films, Lucille Ricksen's path was sealed, whether she realized it or not. Over the course of just 2 years, she appeared in 11 shorts, most released in 1920, with the remaining films following in 1921. The moment she stepped into the series as its young female lead, Lucille quietly crossed an invisible line. Childhood slipped away, replaced by the heavy responsibilities of a professional actress and the family's primary provider. At first, Lucille embraced it. Much of what we know about her inner world comes from the scrapbooks she carefully assembled during those early Hollywood days. Page after page is filled with neatly arranged photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes bursting with excitement and imagination. They reveal a young girl thrilled by the glamour around her, suggesting that after years spent working, she may never have truly known what an ordinary childhood felt like. Yet Edgar Pomeroy offered her a fleeting taste of what she had missed. On set, Lucille was finally surrounded by other children, laughing, playing, and creating together. Moments where she could briefly be just another kid. But that freedom didn't last long. The success of the series pushed her into the public spotlight. Beyond filming, Lucille was expected to travel constantly, appearing in theaters and celebrity events across the country. The adventures that made her famous also tightened the grip of fame, pulling her further away from the childhood she was only just beginning to glimpse. Hollywood was watching closely, and the attention came at a steep price. While she was still no older than 11 on set, Lucille found herself moving in circles filled with the industry's elite. celebrated actors, influential directors, and powerful decision-makers, all of them adults at least twice her age. Critics were quick to praise her, with one review of her work in Edgar Pomeroy boldly declaring her among the most promising young talents Hollywood had ever seen. In that moment, the label actress began to overshadow a far more important truth, that she was still just a child. After completing her commitments to the Edgar Pomeroy series, Lucille appeared in one more film in 1921, once again portraying a child in Kate at 9. On the surface, it seemed like a natural continuation of her career. But what followed was deeply unsettling. Her next role, The Married Flapper, marked a sudden and alarming shift that few at the time chose to question. When The Married Flapper reached theaters in 1922, Lucille was likely only 11 or 12 years old. Yet the girl on screen looked far older, styled, dressed, and made up to resemble a grown woman. Somewhere between 1921 and 1922, the line was crossed. Lucille the child quietly vanished, replaced by Lucille the leading lady. Audiences applauded, studios took note, and offers began pouring in, each one conveniently ignoring the reality of her age. By 1923, her rise seemed unstoppable. Opportunity followed opportunity, and Hollywood treated her as a fully formed star. That year, director Marshall Nealon selected Lucille from countless hopefuls to play the female lead in his upcoming film, The Rendezvous. It was the moment she had been working toward since infancy, a triumphant breakthrough on the surface, yet one that raised an unsettling question: how much of her childhood had been sacrificed to reach it? At last, Lucille stepped fully into the Hollywood spotlight. Yet whether the role she was given was ever appropriate remains deeply troubling. Director Marshall Nealon cast her as Vera, a deeply traumatized Russian girl raised in Siberia after her family, former royalty, was exiled. Over the course of the story, Vera is married twice, first to a brutal Cossack leader, and later to the film's heroic figure. It was a straightforward narrative and a powerful role, but one clearly written for a woman far older than Lucille herself. On the page, Vera was around 18 years old. On set, Lucille's on-screen husbands were played by John Nagel, then 26, and Sid Chaplin, who was 38. Lucille, meanwhile, was no more than 13. Even at the time, the mismatch was impossible to ignore. She may have been gifted, with perfect blonde curls and a captivating presence, but she was still undeniably a child, and no amount of makeup could truly conceal that fact. One reporter who visited the set of The Rendezvous captured the unease many felt. He observed that the Edgar comedies had been Lucille's only real childhood, her sole opportunity to play alongside children her own age. That, he wrote, was what made her so different, almost uncannily so. The situation inspired both pity and relief at once. There was a longing to see her pigtails flying in the wind, cheeks flushed with color, instead of watching her spend entire days portraying the abused wife of a violent Russian character. By the time The Rendezvous reached theaters, the world already regarded Lucille as Hollywood's newest rising star. She appeared in 5 films in 1922 alone. In 1923 and 1924, that number surged to nearly 10 films each year. Her workload became so overwhelming that she could no longer complete one film before starting the next. Lucille had been working almost her entire life, and by the early 1920s, that work had consumed nearly every waking moment. She began overlapping productions, moving from one set to another, living a life defined almost entirely by cameras, scripts, and endless filming schedules. It was an impossible pace for anyone, let alone a child. Even without the physical exhaustion, Lucille was under a different kind of strain. She was constantly surrounded by adults twice, sometimes 3 times, her age. Portraying emotionally complex adult roles was taxing enough, but she was also expected to navigate real-life adult relationships far beyond her years. In 1924, at the height of her career, Lucille was only 13. Yet at the same time, she was referring to men in their 30s as her closest friends. Members of the Rendezvous circle, particularly Sid Chaplin and director Marshall Nealon, were known for their notorious playboy lifestyles. Lucille's close association with such men raised serious concerns, even then. Each year, the Western Association of Motion Picture Advertisers selected 13 young actresses they believed were on the brink of stardom, a prestigious list that later included many future legends. In 1924, Lucille was named among the baby stars, alongside 12 other actresses celebrated as the rising women of the silver screen. But there was a striking difference. With one exception, every other actress on the list was nearly a decade older than her. Had the public truly known Lucille's real age, uncomfortable questions might have followed. Hollywood, however, had a convenient solution. Lucille's birth certificate listed her birth year as 1910, but without public access to that document, confirming her exact age became murky. As her fame skyrocketed, the industry quietly began to add years to her age. Almost overnight, Lucille Ricksen was described as 16 or 17, when just weeks earlier she had been 12 or 13. She had first been marketed as the youngest leading lady on screen, a title Hollywood proudly advertised. Then, just as suddenly, the industry seemed to feel a flicker of shame over how young she truly was. In December 1923, an absurd report appeared in Billboard, so shocking that it has largely faded from history. The article claimed that Lucille, only 13 at the time, had married her former co-star, 38-year-old Sid Chaplin, the half-brother of Charlie Chaplin. Lucille's next film with Sid Chaplin, Galloping Fish, was scheduled for release later in 1924, and with it came a wave of unsettling speculation. The shocking announcement of their supposed marriage left many wondering whether the press had confused on-screen fiction with real life, or whether something far more sinister had taken place. No marriage certificate has ever been found, likely because Chaplin had already been married for nearly 20 years. The story was almost certainly a misprint fueled by gossip, yet those rumors, linking a child to a grown man, helped conceal an even darker reality from the public. During the filming of Galloping Fish, Lucille began to show visible signs of serious illness. Given the circumstances, this was hardly surprising. She had just completed 10 films in only 7 months, an inhuman workload for anyone, especially a child. At last, her mother intervened. Whether motivated by genuine concern for Lucille's health or fear of losing her family's primary source of income is impossible to know. But as 1924 drew to a close, Ingeborg finally cut Hollywood off from her daughter. Studios continued to offer Lucille roles, only to be turned away with the explanation that she was suffering from a nervous breakdown. Hollywood, however, thrived on rumor. Whispers quickly began to circulate, with gossipmongers pointing fingers at Sid Chaplin. They claimed Lucille's illness stemmed from an abortion he had allegedly forced upon her, leading to a life-threatening infection. While dramatic, these stories were not nearly as heartbreaking as the truth. By early 1925, Lucille had not recovered. If anything, her condition had worsened. Always slight and petite, she now appeared dangerously underweight. At just 14 years old, her body had finally reached its breaking point after years of relentless overwork. Doctors diagnosed Lucille with tuberculosis in early 1925. According to the family physician, she had crowded too much work into too short a time and completely overtaxed her strength. Confined to bed and forced into isolation, Lucille failed to improve. Without her income, the family quickly fell into financial hardship. Her older brother, Marshall, left school to find work and help support the household, and some accounts suggest they were forced to move into smaller accommodations just to survive. Most sources indicate that Lucille's father vanished during her illness, despite possibly living nearby. Ingeborg, however, remained constantly at her daughter's side, clinging to hope. Then came a devastating night. Lucille's screams woke her brother, and when he rushed into her room, he found his mother collapsed across the bed, lying atop her daughter. Ingeborg had suffered a massive heart attack while caring for Lucille and died there. Although their father reportedly returned to offer assistance, Lucille and Marshall ultimately turned to the Hollywood community for help, asking Rupert Hughes and Conrad Nagel to become their guardians, a role they accepted only briefly. Exhaustion, illness, and overwhelming grief proved too much for Lucille to endure. She survived her mother by just 2 weeks. Surrounded by her brother and fellow actress Lois Wilson, Lucille succumbed to her illness, leaving behind a brief, tragic legacy, one that remains largely forgotten in the history of Hollywood.